My mother burned all my books because she wants me to be a beauty queen and not a nerdy loser. But what I told her made her freeze in shock. When I got a perfect score on my science exam, she said, "No one likes a know-it-all." When I won the spelling bee, she said, "You'd look prettier if you smiled." Every win I had was something she had to twist into shame. I never talked back. I just went to my room, read my books, and dreamed of getting far, far away. She had been a pageant girl her whole life. She still wore her old crowns around the house sometimes, usually after a few glasses of wine. There were pictures all over the walls, her in glittering dresses, holding trophies. I was always in the background of family photos, in jeans, holding a book, never fitting in. When I turned 16, she decided it was time to fix me. "You're going to compete in the Miss Teen County pageant," she said one morning over breakfast. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. "Mom, I don't want to," I said. "You'll thank me one day. No one respects a girl who hides in fiction," she snapped. I tried to reason with her, telling her about the summer program I got accepted into for advanced biology. She waved the letter in the air, tore it in half, and said, "Nobody wants to date a lab rat." That was the first time I felt real hate toward her. Still, I stayed quiet. I thought if I just ignored the pageant thing, she'd forget. But she didn't. She started buying dresses, makeup, and heels. She signed me up for poise lessons. Every day after school, she'd make me walk around the living room balancing a book on my head. "You need to learn grace," she said. I remember thinking, grace is overrated. Then came the day I got home from school and smelled smoke. I ran into the backyard and froze. There was a pile of ashes in the fire pit, and beside it, the twisted metal edges of what used to be my bookshelf. My mother stood there, holding a lighter, still in her pageant robe. "What did you do?" I screamed. She didn't flinch. "I'm saving you from wasting your life," she said calmly, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. I ran to the fire, tears already burning my eyes. My copy of Jane Eyre was half melted. My science magazines were ash. The edges of my notes curled in the dirt. She burned everything. Every single book I ever owned. "You'll thank me when you're beautiful," she said. I lunged at her and tried to grab the lighter. She shoved me back so hard I fell. "You're hysterical. You think this world rewards girls who hide in corners? Look at me. I was someone. You could be someone too." I screamed at her that I didn't want to be her, that I'd rather die than live her life. Her face twisted. "You ungrateful brat. Do you know how much I gave up for you? I could have been Miss State if I hadn't gotten pregnant. I'll never forget that moment." Her voice cracked, and for a second, I thought she was going to cry. But she didn't. She just stared at me with disgust. That night, I slept on the floor because the smell of burnt paper filled my room. The next morning, she acted like nothing happened. She made pancakes. She hummed. She told me we were going dress shopping after lunch. I didn't speak to her. I went to school and told my teacher what happened. She called the counselor. The counselor called my mom. My mom came in smiling like she was being interviewed. She said, "Teenage dramatics. You know how they are." The counselor nodded and told me to try to understand her intentions. I sat there shaking. No one cared. That night, she came into my room holding a dress bag. "This will make you look like a princess," she said. I told her she'd destroyed everything that made me happy. She said, "Good. Now you can focus on being someone." I said nothing. I waited until she left, then took the bag and stuffed it in the trash. The next morning, she found it. She dragged me out of bed, grabbed the scissors, and cut my hair in chunks while screaming, "Ungrateful little witch." My scalp burned from her pulling so hard. I didn't cry. I just stared at her. That seemed to scare her more than anything. "You'll regret this one day," she said. "You'll see I was right." I didn't say anything until she turned to leave. Then I whispered, "I hope one day you wake up and realize that all your beauty rotted away a long time ago. I hope every time you look in the mirror, you see what you did to me." She froze in the doorway. She stood there for maybe 10 seconds, her hand gripping the doorframe so tight her knuckles turned white. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say something, then closed again. She tried a second time and nothing came out except this weird choking sound. Then she turned and walked down the hall to her bedroom and shut the door hard enough that the pictures on the wall rattled. I sat down on my bed and touched the chunks of hair hanging around my face. Some pieces were maybe 2 inches long, others almost down to my shoulders where she'd missed or gotten tired. My scalp still burned from where she'd yanked while cutting. But the weird thing was, I felt calm. Like really calm for the first time in weeks. The house went completely silent. No TV sounds, no footsteps, no humming from the kitchen. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway and a dog barking 3 houses down. I realized I wasn't scared anymore about what would happen next. The worst thing I could imagine had already happened, and I was still here, still breathing, still me. I didn't go to the school the next day. I couldn't face people seeing what she'd done to my hair. I texted my friend Sophia that I was sick and turned my phone off. My mother didn't come out of her room at all. I made myself cereal around 8 and ate it standing at the counter. Around noon, I heard crying through her bedroom door. These loud, gulping sobs that went on for maybe 20 minutes. I stood in the hallway listening and didn't feel anything except tired. I didn't knock or ask if she was okay. I just went back to my room and tried to read but couldn't focus on the words. My father came home early from his sales route around 3. I heard his truck in the driveway and went to the kitchen to make a sandwich, so I wouldn't have to explain why I was home. He walked in through the garage door carrying his briefcase and stopped dead when he saw me. His eyes went straight to my hair and his whole face changed. He asked what happened and his voice came out tight and careful, like he already knew but didn't want to believe it. I told him everything about the books she burned and the dress I threw away, and how she dragged me out of bed that morning and cut my hair while screaming at me. I said it all in this flat, emotionless voice like I was reading a grocery list. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, like he'd aged 10 years in 5 minutes. He kept saying he didn't know it was this bad, over and over like that was supposed to mean something. I wanted to scream at him that he should have known, that he lived here too, that he heard her say cruel things to me every single day. But I didn't. I just finished making my sandwich and ate it while he sat there. That night, my parents had a huge fight behind their closed bedroom door. I was in my room trying to do homework when it started around 8. My mother was screaming that I was ungrateful and dramatic, that she'd given up everything for me and this was how I repaid her. My father's voice got louder than I'd heard it in years. He said something about the hair, and she screamed back that I deserved it for throwing away the dress. The fight went on for over an hour with things crashing and doors slamming. I put my headphones in but could still hear them through the music. Eventually it got quiet and I fell asleep with my light on. The next morning, my father knocked on my door before I was even awake. He came in and sat on the edge of my bed and told me I didn't have to do the pageant if I didn't want to. He said he was sorry and that things were going to change. I just nodded because I didn't believe him yet. At breakfast, my mother wouldn't look at me. She sat at the table staring at her coffee cup with red eyes like she'd been crying all night. Nobody talked. My father made toast and I ate a banana standing up. The silence felt different from before, heavier somehow. I went back to the school the next day wearing a baseball cap pulled low. My English teacher, Mr. Burr, noticed something was wrong right away. He's the kind of teacher who actually pays attention to students instead of just going through the motions. After class, he asked me to stay behind and waited until everyone else left. He asked if I was okay, and I felt my throat get tight. I tried to say yes, but it came out shaky. He said I seemed different lately and he was worried. That's when I broke down. I told him a simplified version of what happened, leaving out the worst parts but enough that he understood. I said my mother burned my books and cut my hair and I didn't know what to do. He listened without interrupting and his face got serious. When I finished, he wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to me. He said some things are too big to handle alone, and gave me the name of the school counselor. He told me to go see her during my free period and that she was good at helping students through difficult situations. I met with Ariella Henson during my free period that same day. Her office was in the back corner of the guidance suite, smaller than I expected with plants on the windowsill and a couch instead of regular chairs. She was younger than I thought a counselor would be, maybe in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back. She didn't do the fake sympathy thing that adults usually do. She just gestured for me to sit down and asked what was going on. Her voice was direct and calm. I started talking and she took notes on a yellow legal pad, asking questions that were specific and careful. She asked when the hair cutting happened and if my mother had hurt me physically before she asked about my father and where he was during all this. She wrote everything down in neat handwriting and I felt like maybe someone was finally taking this seriously. Ariella pulled out her phone and asked if she could take pictures of my hair. I sat still while she moved around me, the camera clicking softly as she documented the uneven chunks and the spots where my scalp still looked red from where my mother had pulled too hard. She asked if I had any other proof of what had been happening, and I told her about the burnt books in the backyard, how there might still be ashes in the fire pit if it hadn't rained. She wrote that down in her notes, underlining it twice, and said she wanted me to come back tomorrow so we could talk more about next steps. I nodded and left her office feeling strange, like I'd just reported a crime instead of talking about my own mother. That night at dinner, my mother acted completely normal. She made my favorite chicken parmesan and asked about my homework like nothing had happened, like she hadn't attacked me with scissors 2 days ago. I gave her one-word answers and took my plate to my room, eating alone while I heard her doing dishes downstairs. The next day was the same. She made pancakes for breakfast and asked if I needed lunch money. I said no and left for school without looking at her. On the third day, she made pot roast and tried to talk about a movie she wanted us to watch together. I could see it was driving her crazy, the way I wouldn't engage, wouldn't give her anything to work with. She kept glancing at me with this desperate look like she was waiting for me to crack and tell her everything was fine. I just ate my food and went back to my room, and I heard her crying softly in the kitchen after I left. The next afternoon, I was getting the mail when Rosa Mercier stopped me from her front porch. She's lived next door for as long as I can remember, a quiet woman in her 60s who keeps to herself mostly. She asked if I was okay, her voice low and careful. She said she'd heard yelling a few days ago and saw smoke coming from our backyard, and she'd been worried about me ever since I tried to say I was fine. But my voice came out shaky. She walked down from her porch and stood next to me by the mailbox, not touching me but close enough that I could smell her lavender perfume. She said if I ever needed to talk, her door was always open. That's when I started crying, right there on the sidewalk with the mail in my hands. Rosa put her arm around my shoulders and guided me to her porch, sitting me down on the steps while she went inside to make tea. Her house smelled like cinnamon and old books. She brought out 2 mugs and sat next to me, not saying anything until I'd stopped crying enough to breathe normally. Then she told me her own mother had been like mine, controlling and cruel in ways that left no visible marks. She said she used to hide in the library after school to avoid going home, that she'd wished someone had helped her when she was my age, but nobody ever did. She said she wasn't going to make that same mistake with me. Before I left, Rosa wrote her phone number on a piece of paper and pressed it into my hand. She said I could come over anytime, day or night, that her guest room was always available if I needed space. It was the first time an adult had offered me actual help without conditions attached, without making it about what I should do differently or how I should try harder to understand my mother's intentions. I walked home with the paper folded in my pocket, feeling like maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. A few days later, Ariella called me back to her office during lunch. She said she'd been talking with her sister Francine, who worked as a social worker for the county. She wanted to know if I felt safe at home. I sat there looking at the plants on her windowsill, trying to figure out how to answer that. I told her I didn't think my mother would hurt me again physically, that she seemed scared of what she'd done, but I also didn't feel like I could breathe in that house. Everything felt heavy and wrong, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Ariella nodded and wrote something in her notes. She said there were options we could explore together, that I didn't have to figure this out alone. That afternoon, my father picked me up from the school early. He didn't explain where we were going until we pulled into the parking lot of a salon downtown inside. A woman with short gray hair looked at my destroyed haircut and didn't ask what happened, just guided me to a chair and started working. She was gentle, her scissors making soft snipping sounds as she evened out the chunks my mother had cut. She asked careful questions about what I wanted, if I was okay with going shorter to fix the damage, and I could tell she knew this wasn't a normal bad haircut. When she finished, my hair was in a short pixie cut that actually looked intentional instead of violent. I stared at myself in the mirror and felt something loosen in my chest. Like maybe I could be a person again instead of just a collection of damage my father paid at the front desk. And we walked out to the parking lot. He stopped by the car and turned to face me, his hands shoved in his pockets. He said he was sorry, that he should have protected me better, that he'd been too afraid of conflict to see how bad things had gotten. His voice cracked on the last part, and he looked away, blinking hard. When we got home, my mother was in the kitchen making dinner. She heard us come in and turned around, and when she saw my new haircut, her face crumpled. She stood there holding a wooden spoon, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find words. Finally, she said I looked beautiful, but then she added that I'd ruined my chances for the pageant now, and I couldn't tell if she was relieved or devastated. Her voice had this strange quality, like she was mourning something, but didn't know if she was allowed to. I walked past her without responding and went to my room, closing the door quietly behind me. Through the wall, I could hear her talking to my father in a low, urgent voice, but I couldn't make out the words. I lay on my bed touching my short hair, feeling the weight of everything that had changed in just a few days, and for the first time since the book burning, I felt like maybe I had a chance at surviving this. 2 days later, the phone rang during dinner and my mother answered it in the kitchen. I was clearing plates when I heard her voice change to that bright, fake tone she used with people outside the family. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and listened. She told the person on the other end that I wouldn't be competing in the pageant due to unforeseen circumstances, and her voice shook on the word circumstances. There was a long pause while she listened, and then she said something about family matters and thanked them for understanding. When she hung up, I heard her lean against the counter, breathing hard like she'd been running. I went back to my room before she could see me there. That night around 10, I heard footsteps in the hallway, and then a soft knock on my door. I didn't answer, but she opened it anyway. She was carrying a cardboard box, the kind that copy paper comes in, and she set it down just inside my room without looking at me. Then she left and closed the door behind her. I stared at the box for a long time before I got up to look. Inside were books, maybe 20 of them, all damaged by fire and smoke. The edges were black and curled, the covers warped, but they were readable. She must have pulled them out of the fire after I went inside that day. I sat on the floor and went through them one by one, touching the burnt pages. Near the bottom, I found my copy of Jane Eyre. The cover was mostly gone and the first few pages were ash, but the rest of the book was intact. There was a bookmark in it that I didn't recognize, just a plain piece of paper with my mother's handwriting on it. It said, "I'm sorry," and nothing else. I put the book on my nightstand and shoved the box under my bed. The next morning, Ariella called me to her office during first period. She said she'd spoken with my father and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon with both my parents. When I got to her office after school, my parents were already there, sitting in chairs across from Ariella's desk. My mother's makeup was perfect, and she sat with her back straight, hands folded in her lap. My father looked tired and kept rubbing his face. Ariella asked me to sit, and then she started talking in this calm, clinical voice about what I'd told her. She used words like emotional manipulation and psychological harm and physical assault. My mother started to interrupt, but Ariella held up her hand and kept going. My father's face got harder and harder as she talked, his jaw clenched tight. When Ariella finished, my mother tried to explain. She talked about wanting better for me, about not wanting me to waste my potential hiding behind books. Her voice got higher and faster as she went on. Ariella let her finish, and then she cut through all of it. She said what my mother had done was controlling behavior and emotional abuse, and the hair cutting was assault. She said it plain and simple. No soft words to make it easier. My mother's face went white. My father stood up and said he was taking a week off work starting tomorrow. He said my mother would be staying with her sister during that time. My mother turned to stare at him with her mouth open. She looked shocked and betrayed, like she couldn't believe he was taking my side. But she didn't argue, just nodded once and looked down at her hands. That week with just my father in the house felt strange and quiet. He didn't really know what to do with me. He'd leave for the grocery store and come back with things he thought I might like, random snacks and magazines about science. He asked careful questions about my classes and what I wanted to study in college. One night he made spaghetti and we ate at the kitchen table instead of in front of the TV like we usually did. He told me he'd been putting money aside in an account for my college that my mother didn't know about. He said he always knew I was smart and he wanted to make sure I could go wherever I got accepted. I just sat there holding my fork, not sure what to say. On Thursday, Francine came to the house. She was Ariella's sister, but she looked nothing like her. She was older, with gray hair pulled back in a bun, and she wore a suit that looked too formal for our living room. She talked to my father first while I waited in my room, and then she came upstairs alone. She sat in my desk chair and asked me questions about how I felt at home, what I wanted to happen next. She didn't rush me or act like my answers were wrong. When I told her I didn't want to press charges or go into foster care, she just nodded and wrote notes. I said I needed my mother to get help, and I needed space to figure out who I am without her voice in my head. Francine looked at me for a long moment and then said that sounded very reasonable. She asked if I felt safe with my father, and I said yes. She asked if I thought my mother would hurt me again, and I said I didn't know, but I didn't think so. She wrote everything down in her notebook and told me she'd be checking in regularly to make sure things stayed okay. When my mother came back the following Sunday, my father sat us both down at the kitchen table and laid out the new rules in a voice that didn't leave room for argument. My mother would start seeing a therapist twice a week starting that Wednesday. I got a lock installed on my bedroom door that same afternoon, and my father handed me the only 2 keys. Family counseling was mandatory every Thursday at 5, and if my mother missed a single session, she'd have to move out again. My mother sat with her hands folded, nodding at everything, but I could see her jaw working like she was chewing on words she couldn't say. That first week back felt like walking on glass. Everyone careful and quiet. My mother making dinner and asking about homework in this overly polite voice that made my skin crawl. Thursday came and we drove to the therapist's office in silence, my father's hands tight on the steering wheel. The waiting room had those generic landscape paintings and magazines nobody ever reads, and we sat in a row not looking at each other until a woman called us back. The therapist's name was Dr. Adams, and she had gray hair and glasses, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see through every lie you'd ever told. The first session was worse than I expected. Dr. Adams asked questions in this calm, steady voice while my mother cried through most of it, tissues piling up in her lap. She asked about the book burning and the hair cutting, and my mother kept saying she just wanted me to reach my potential, to not waste my life. Dr. Adams wrote things down in her notebook and asked my father why he'd let it go on so long, and he rubbed his face and said he thought it was normal mother-daughter conflict until it wasn't. I sat there feeling numb and disconnected, like I was watching it happen to someone else. The session went on for an hour, and when it ended, we drove home in the same heavy silence, nobody knowing what to say. The next week, Dr. Adams focused on my mother's past, asking about her own childhood and her pageant days. My mother talked about winning crowns and feeling beautiful and important, and then she admitted she got pregnant with me at 19. She'd been training for Miss State, had a real shot at winning, but then the test came back positive and everything stopped. Dr. Adams asked if she'd been blaming me for that all these years, and my mother opened her mouth but nothing came out. Just this awful silence that answered the question better than words could have. I felt something crack open in my chest, this understanding that my mother had been punishing me my whole life for existing. Dr. Adams suggested I start seeing someone separately, and the following Tuesday I met with a woman named Dr. Reeves who specialized in family trauma. Her office was smaller and warmer than Dr. Adams's, with plants on the windowsill and a couch that didn't feel like a doctor's office. Dr. Reeves asked me to tell her my story, and I did. All of it. And she listened without interrupting or making excuses for my mother. She told me that understanding why someone hurts you doesn't mean accepting it, that my mother's damage didn't excuse what she'd done to me. It felt like someone finally gave me permission to be angry, to not forgive just because we were related. Around that same time, Wyatt Burr pulled me aside after class, and asked about the summer biology program I'd mentioned months ago. I told him my mother had torn up the acceptance letter, and he got this determined look on his face. He helped me track down the program coordinator and explain the situation, asked if I could submit a late application. We stayed after school for 3 days working on the application, and he wrote me a recommendation letter that made me cry when I read it. He called me brilliant and curious and said I had the kind of mind that could change the world if given the chance. 2 weeks later, I got an email saying I'd been accepted with a full scholarship covering everything. I printed it out and brought it home and found my parents in the living room. My father read it and pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe, and my mother looked at the paper and said, "That's wonderful," in a voice that sounded like she was forcing each word past a wall in her throat. That same week, Rosa invited me over for dinner, said she wanted to make it a regular thing if I was interested. Her house smelled like garlic and herbs and felt warm in a way my house never did. We ate pasta at her kitchen table, and she told me stories about her own mother, who'd been controlling and critical, and made Rosa feel small her whole childhood. Rosa said she'd left home at 18 and never looked back, built a life on her own terms doing work she loved. She looked at me across the table and said, I could do the same thing, that I didn't owe my mother my future, just because she'd given me life. In our next family therapy session, my mother had what Dr. Adams called a breakthrough. My mother admitted she was jealous of me, of my intelligence and my opportunities and my whole future stretching out ahead of me. She said she looked at me and saw everything she'd given up, everything she'd never have again. Dr. Adams asked if she understood how unfair that was, and my mother nodded, crying again, saying she knew but couldn't seem to stop feeling it. Hearing her say it out loud hurt in a way I didn't expect, like she'd confirmed something I'd always known but hoped wasn't true. That night I sat at my desk and wrote my mother a letter, the words coming easier on paper than they ever did out loud. I told her I forgave her for being human and flawed, for having her own pain and damage. But I also told her I didn't forgive what she'd done to me, that I wouldn't pretend it hadn't left marks I'd carry forever. I said I understood her, but understanding wasn't the same as accepting, that she'd have to live with what she'd done, just like I had to live with what she'd taken from me. I left the letter on her pillow before I went to bed. The next morning there was a letter on my desk, my mother's handwriting messier than usual, and the paper wrinkled like she'd cried on it. She wrote that she knew she couldn't undo what she'd done, couldn't give me back the books or the hair or the years of feeling small. She said she understood if I never wanted a real relationship with her, that she'd accept whatever I decided to give her or not give her. She signed it just Mom, no love or apologies, just her name at the bottom of the page. Spring came slowly that year, the winter dragging on until March when the weather finally warmed up enough for me to eat lunch outside, with friends I'd stopped talking to during the worst months. I sat with them at the picnic tables near the library, and they didn't ask too many questions about what had happened, just welcomed me back like I'd never left. We talked about normal things like homework and weekend plans and which colleges we were applying to. I told them about the summer biology program, and they seemed genuinely excited for me, asking what kind of research I'd be doing. Life felt almost normal except for the careful distance between my mother and me at home. We moved around each other like roommates who'd had a fight, polite but not warm, functional but not close. She made dinner and I helped clean up, and we talked about school and the weather and nothing that mattered. In late April, my mother knocked on my bedroom door while I was studying for finals. She asked if she could come to my school's academic awards ceremony, where I was getting recognition for my science grades. I stared at my textbook for a long moment before answering. Part of me wanted to say no, wanted to keep this thing separate from her, but another part remembered the letter she'd written, and the therapy sessions where she actually seemed to be trying. I said yes, but told her I didn't want her making a big deal out of it. She nodded and said she'd just sit quietly in the audience. The ceremony was in the school auditorium on a Thursday evening. I sat with the other honor students in the front rows while my father and mother found seats in the middle section. When they called my name for the Science Achievement Award, I walked up on stage and shook the principal's hand and accepted the certificate. I looked out at the audience and saw my father grinning and clapping hard, and my mother sitting next to him with her hands folded in her lap, smiling but not making any big gestures or standing up like some of the other parents. She just sat there and watched me, and somehow that felt like enough. After the ceremony ended, people milled around in the lobby taking photos and congratulating each other. My father hugged me and said he was so proud, and I saw my mother standing a few feet away waiting her turn. When my father stepped back, she moved closer and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She told me she was proud of me and that she'd been wrong about everything. She didn't reach out to hug me or ask if I forgave her, just stated it like a fact she needed me to know. I said thank you because I didn't know what else to say, and she nodded and turned away to let other people congratulate me. 2 weeks later, school ended, and I packed my bags for the summer biology program. My father drove me to the university campus 3 hours away where the program was being held. The dorms were old but clean, and my roommate was a girl from another state who loved genetics as much as I loved cellular biology. We stayed up late that first night talking about our favorite science topics, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for months. The program was everything I'd hoped for. The work was challenging in the best way, with lab experiments that actually mattered and teachers who treated us like real scientists instead of just kids. The other students were all like me, people who got excited about research papers and spent their free time reading science journals. I called my father every few days and told him about the experiments I was running and the lectures I was attending. He sounded genuinely happy for me, asking questions and remembering details from previous calls. 3 weeks into the program, a package arrived at the dorm with my name on it. I opened it in my room and found 6 books inside, all new copies of ones my mother had burned. There was Jane Eyre and my favorite biology textbook and the novel about Marie Curie I'd been reading when everything fell apart. No note came with the books, but I recognized my mother's handwriting on the shipping label. I sat on my bed holding Jane Eyre and felt something complicated twist in my stomach. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was recognition that she was trying in the only way she knew how. In late August, right before I had to go back for senior year, we had a family therapy session. My mother talked about her own mother, who'd been critical and controlling and made her feel like nothing she did was ever good enough. She described growing up in a house where love came with conditions and approval had to be earned through performance. I listened and started to see the pattern of damage passing down through generations, mother to daughter to me. It didn't erase what she'd done to me or make it okay, but it helped me understand that hurt people, that she'd been acting out her own pain on me because she didn't know any other way. I waited until she finished talking. Then I looked at her across the therapist's office and said, I needed her to accept that I was never going to be the daughter she'd imagined. I told her, if she couldn't do that, we couldn't have a real relationship, that I wouldn't spend my life trying to become someone I wasn't just to make her happy. She sat very still for a moment, then nodded and said she was trying, that it was hard to let go of the dreams she'd had, but she was working on it. The therapist asked my father if he had anything to add. My father shifted in his chair and admitted that he'd enabled my mother's behavior by staying silent and avoiding conflict. He said he'd known things were bad, but hadn't wanted to face how bad, hadn't wanted to deal with the hard conversations and the tension that would come from standing up to her. He apologized to both of us for not being stronger when it mattered, for choosing his own comfort over protecting me. My mother looked surprised, like she hadn't expected him to take responsibility, and I felt a strange mix of anger and relief that he'd finally said it out loud. Senior year started in September, and I threw myself into college applications. I spent hours researching schools with strong science programs, focusing on ones far enough away to give me real independence. I made lists of universities in other states, places 8 or 10 hours from home where I could build a life completely separate from my mother's influence. I filled out applications at the kitchen table, and my mother would walk past sometimes, glancing at the school names on my laptop screen, but she never commented or tried to talk me out of applying to distant places. She just kept walking, and I took that as progress. In November, I got an email saying I'd been accepted early decision to a university 8 hours away. They were offering me a generous financial aid package that would cover almost everything. I printed out the acceptance letter and brought it downstairs where my parents were watching television. My father read it and jumped up to hug me, saying it was a great school and he was so proud. My mother took the letter from him and read it carefully, then looked up at me and said it was a great school, and I could tell she meant it, even though saying it clearly hurt her. She handed the letter back and told me congratulations, and for the first time in a long time, I believed she actually wanted me to be happy, even if my happiness meant leaving her behind. A week before I had to leave for college, my mother knocked on my bedroom door and asked if we could have lunch together, just the two of us. I said okay because I figured I owed her that much after everything, and we drove to this small Italian place she used to take me to when I was little. The restaurant hadn't changed at all. Same red checkered tablecloths and the smell of garlic bread filling the air. We sat in a booth by the window and ordered pasta, and for the first few minutes neither of us said much beyond basic stuff about the food. Then my mother put down her fork and started talking about being 19 and finding out she was pregnant with me. She told me she'd been training for Miss State, practicing her talent routine 4 hours a day, working with a vocal coach twice a week. She said when she saw the positive test, she locked herself in the bathroom and cried for 3 hours because she knew it was over. Her mother had told her she was throwing her life away, that no man would want a woman with a baby and no accomplishments. She married my father 6 months later in a quick courthouse ceremony, wearing a dress she bought off the rack because there wasn't time for anything fancy. She described feeling like she disappeared into being someone's wife, and then someone's mother, like the girl who'd won pageants and dreamed of bigger stages just stopped existing. She told me she'd wanted me to shine the way she never got to, wanted to watch me succeed so she could feel like her sacrifice meant something. Then she looked at me across the table and said it was unfair to both of us, putting that kind of weight on my shoulders. I sat there pushing pasta around my plate, processing what she'd just said. I told her I understood her pain, and that losing your dreams must have been really hard, but understanding didn't mean I could just accept what she'd done to me. I said burning my books and cutting my hair and trying to force me into her mold had damaged me in ways I was still figuring out. She nodded and her eyes got wet, but she didn't cry. She said she didn't expect me to forget any of it or pretend it didn't happen. She just hoped that maybe someday, after I'd had time and space to become whoever I was going to be, I might want her in my life in some small way, I told her maybe. And that was the most honest answer I could give her right then. The next week, Rosa threw me a going-away party in her backyard with neighbors and some friends from the school. She'd hung string lights and set up tables with food, and people kept coming up to congratulate me on getting into such a good school. My mother showed up halfway through wearing a simple dress, not one of her pageant outfits, and she stayed near the back of the yard talking quietly with other parents. I watched her a few times and noticed she wasn't trying to make it about her or take over conversations. She just stood there holding a plastic cup of lemonade, smiling when people talked to her, and when someone asked about my college plans, she said I was going to do amazing things. Rosa came up beside me at one point and squeezed my shoulder, telling me my mother was really trying. I said I knew, but trying didn't erase the past, and Rosa nodded and said that was fair. The party went until dark, and when people started leaving, my mother came over to say goodbye. She hugged me briefly and told me to have fun at the school, then left without lingering or making a scene. The night before I was supposed to leave, I was packing my last boxes when my mother knocked on my door. She came in carrying a cardboard box that looked heavy and set it on my bed. Inside were all her old pageant crowns, maybe 15 of them, each one wrapped in tissue paper. There was a note on top in her handwriting that said she was donating them to a local theater program and moving forward instead of living in the past. I picked up one of the crowns and remembered seeing her wear it around the house when I was younger. How it had seemed so important to her, I asked her if she was sure about giving them away, and she said yes, that holding on to them hadn't made her happy. It had just kept her stuck. She told me she wanted me to know she was serious about changing, that she understood she couldn't keep defining herself by things that happened 20 years ago. I put the crown back in the box and thanked her, and she left without asking for anything in return. The morning I left for college, my father loaded my stuff into his car while my mother stayed in the house. We'd all agreed it was better if she didn't come on the drive, that it would be too hard for everyone. She came out to the driveway when we were ready to go and hugged me tight, her arms shaking a little. She whispered that she loved me, and I said I know, because I did know, even though her love had been twisted up with her own damage and had hurt me badly. She let go and stepped back, watching as I got in the passenger seat. My father started the engine, and I looked at her standing there in the driveway, smaller somehow than she used to seem, and I felt something complicated that wasn't quite forgiveness but wasn't hate either. College was everything I'd hoped it would be. I had a small dorm room with a roommate who was studying engineering, and my classes were actually challenging in ways that made me excited to learn. People in my biology lectures wanted to talk about science and research, not about how I looked or whether I was too serious. I joined a study group and started working in a lab with a professor who was doing genetics research. I called my father every Sunday, and we'd talk for an hour about my classes and his work and normal family stuff. I called my mother maybe once every 2 weeks, keeping the conversation short and focused on surface things like the weather and what I was eating. She never pushed for more, and I appreciated that. My mother kept going to therapy throughout my first semester and started sending me texts every few days. They were short messages asking how my exams went, or saying she'd read an article about something related to my major. She remembered details I'd mentioned in our brief phone calls, like the names of my professors or which classes I liked best. It felt like genuine effort, like she was actually listening instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. I didn't always respond right away, but I did respond, and slowly it started feeling less forced. When winter break came and I went home, the house looked different the moment I walked in. My mother had taken down most of the pageant photos from the walls and replaced them with family pictures that actually included me looking happy. There was one from my 8th grade science fair where I was holding my project board and grinning, another from a camping trip we'd taken when I was 12. The living room felt lighter somehow without all those images of her in evening gowns and crowns. My mother had also gained some weight and cut her hair shorter, and she looked more comfortable in her own skin than I'd seen her in years. She was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the tight clothes she used to favor, and when she smiled at me, it reached her eyes. A few days into break, my mother asked if I wanted to get coffee with her at the place downtown. We sat in a corner booth and she told me about her therapy sessions, how her therapist had helped her see the patterns of seeking validation through appearance and achievement. She said she'd started volunteering at a literacy program at the library, working with elementary school kids who were struggling with reading. She talked about this one boy who'd finally sounded out a whole sentence by himself, and how proud she'd felt watching him succeed. She seemed genuinely happy about it, not like she was doing it to prove something to me or anyone else. I asked her questions about the program, and she answered them with real excitement, describing the different kids she worked with and the progress they were making. Sitting there watching her talk about helping these children learn to read, I realized my mother was becoming someone I didn't entirely know, someone who existed beyond her past beauty and failed dreams. It was strange and uncomfortable, but also kind of hopeful in a way I hadn't expected. When I got back to the school in January, something felt different about the distance between us. I called my mother on a Tuesday night after my genetics lecture, and we talked for almost an hour about my classes and her volunteer work at the library. She remembered the names of my professors and asked how my research project was going. The conversation felt easier than it used to, like we weren't both waiting for the other person to say something hurtful. I started looking forward to her calls instead of dreading them. We talked about surface stuff mostly, like the weather and what I was eating in the dining hall, but there was less tension underneath it all. She told me about the kids she was working with, and I told her about my lab assignments. Neither of us brought up the past or tried to fix everything at once. By March, I had to declare my major, and I chose biology with a focus on genetics. I called my mother to tell her and expected the usual dismissive response. Instead, she asked me what kind of research I wanted to do and whether I was interested in medical applications or pure science. I was so surprised I almost dropped the phone. She said she'd been reading articles online about CRISPR and gene therapy because she wanted to understand what I was studying. That touched me more than I wanted to admit. She'd actually made an effort to learn about my world instead of just tolerating it. We talked for 2 hours that night about my classes and career options, and she asked smart questions that showed she'd really been reading those articles. When finals week came in May, I was exhausted but also proud of what I'd built. I had a 3.8 GPA and a position in a research lab for the summer. I had friends who actually liked me for who I was instead of trying to change me. I had a relationship with my mother that was still complicated and probably always would be. But we were both trying to be better than our worst moments. That felt like enough for now. She would never be the mother I wished I'd had, and I would never be the daughter she'd wanted. But maybe we could figure out how to be the people we actually were to each other. I packed up my dorm room at the end of May, and my father came to pick me up. My mother had sent me a care package with new lab notebooks and a book about women in science. There was a card inside that just said she was proud of me. I put it in my backpack and decided that was a good place to start.